The night flight was a heavy blanket of silence and dim blue lights. In business class, a single father in a faded denim jacket sat quietly, clutching an old backpack. He looked tired, his hands worn from hard work. Suddenly, the co-pilot stepped out, eyes narrowing as he spotted the man. With a cold, arrogant scowl, he pointed toward the back of the plane. "Sir, move seats. This section is for premium clients only." The man looked up calmly. "Is there a problem?" The pilot didn't hesitate. "You don't belong here." 10 minutes later, the cockpit fell into a terrifying silence. Lucas Bennett was 41 years old, but his hands told a story that his face tried to hide. He was a man built from grit and quiet determination, a billionaire who spent his days in boardrooms and his nights reading bedtime stories. To the world of high finance, he was a ghost, a silent investor who moved billions with a single signature but never appeared in a magazine or a televised interview. He valued his privacy more than his profit margins. But to 9-year-old Ethan, he was just Dad. Lucas had been raising Ethan alone since his wife, Sarah, passed away from complications during childbirth. Every decision Lucas made was for the boy. He didn't wear a Rolex and he didn't fly in a private jet with his name emblazoned on the tail. He preferred the anonymity of the crowd. On this particular evening, Lucas had booked a flight that was technically a private charter operated by his own holding company. But he had opened the business class cabin to the public to optimize the route's efficiency. He boarded early, dressed in his travel uniform, an old denim jacket and a pair of worn-out boots. He wasn't trying to hide his wealth. He simply didn't see the need to broadcast it. He chose seat 4A, near the emergency exit. As a former military pilot who had flown transport missions in high-stress zones, he liked the extra legroom and the proximity to the exit. It was an old habit that died hard. As the cabin filled with the smell of expensive perfume and the rustle of newspapers, Lucas sat quietly, his mind on the business deal waiting for him at the destination. Across the aisle, 2 executives were discussing a merger, their voices loud and self-important. They looked at Lucas and his battered backpack with a mixture of confusion and disdain. They saw a man who didn't belong in the leather-stitched seats of the business cabin. They saw a man who had likely stumbled into the wrong section or spent his last cent on an upgrade he couldn't afford. Lucas noticed their stares, but he didn't react. He had spent his entire life being underestimated, and he found that it was often a strategic advantage. Then came the co-pilot, a young man named Bradley. Bradley was relatively new to the company, and his uniform was pressed so sharply it looked like it could cut paper. He took his job seriously, but he confused authority with ego. He was scanning the cabin when his eyes locked onto Lucas. To Bradley, Lucas was an eyesore in his pristine cabin. He didn't check the manifest properly. He didn't look at the passenger profiles. He only looked at the denim jacket. He walked over, his shadow falling over Lucas's book. "Sir, you're going to need to move to the economy section," Bradley said, his voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Lucas looked up, his expression neutral. "I'm sorry, is there a mechanical issue with the seat?" Lucas asked. Bradley scoffed, crossing his arms. "No, there's a professional issue. This section is reserved for our premium clients. I suspect there's been a ticketing error, but regardless, you need to relocate. This seat is for someone who actually fits the profile of this airline." The executives across the aisle chuckled. One of them whispered something about homeless upgrades. Lucas felt a familiar sting of disappointment, not for himself, but for the lack of basic human decency in the room. He could have ended it right there. He could have produced his identification. He could have mentioned that his company's logo was on the very napkins Bradley was holding. But Lucas believed that truth didn't need to be rushed. He believed that character was revealed in how people treated those they thought were below them. "I understand," Lucas said quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply gathered his backpack, stood up, and walked toward the back of the plane. He found a seat in the very last row of economy, squeezed between a crying toddler and a man who was already snoring. The flight attendants in the back looked at him with sympathy, but they didn't question the co-pilot's order. As Lucas sat down, he looked out the small window at the wing of the aircraft. He knew every bolt and every hydraulic line in that wing. He knew that the very pilot who had just insulted him was currently being paid by a man he had just kicked out of his own seat. Lucas settled in, the silence of his own mind far louder than the noise of the cabin. Up in the cockpit, Captain Miller was finishing the pre-flight checklist. Miller was a veteran pilot with 30 years of experience, a man who respected the machine and the people who flew in it. He noticed Bradley returning to his seat with a smug look on his face. "Everything okay back there, Bradley?" Miller asked, his eyes never leaving the instrument panel. "Just clearing out a bit of a seating error, Captain. Someone tried to sneak into 4A in a denim jacket. Handled it," Bradley replied, checking his watch. Miller frowned. He didn't like Bradley's attitude, but he was more concerned with the flight plan. The ground crew finished their work, and the aircraft began its pushback. But as Miller went to initialize the onboard computer systems, the screen flickered red. A notification popped up that he had never seen in 3 decades of flying. It wasn't an engine fault or a weather delay. It was a security lockout. The message read, "Operational authorization pending. Owner verification required." Miller stared at the screen. This was a private charter aircraft managed by a third-party firm, but it was ultimately owned by a shell company under the Bennett Group. "That's strange," Miller muttered. He tried to bypass the lockout, but the system wouldn't budge. He pulled up the passenger manifest on his tablet, which had finally synced with the main office. At the very top of the list, marked in bright gold with the designation Owner/Primary, was a name, Lucas Bennett. Miller's heart skipped a beat. He knew that name. He had never met the man, but he knew that Lucas Bennett was the reason this airline existed. He was the reason Miller had a pension and Bradley had a job. Miller turned to Bradley, his face pale. "Bradley, that man you moved from 4A, what did he look like?" Bradley shrugged, oblivious to the storm brewing. "I told you, just a guy in a worn-out jacket. Smelled like coffee and old books." "Why?" Miller felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Bradley, look at the screen. Look at the owner of this aircraft." Bradley leaned in, his eyes scanning the manifest. When he saw the name, his mouth went dry. "Lucas Bennett? You think that guy?" The tension in the cockpit was now thick enough to suffocate. Bradley's fingers hovered over the console, trembling. He realized that the man he had treated like a vagrant was the very architect of his current reality. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, Lucas was calmly explaining the physics of flight to the curious toddler next to him, his voice a soothing contrast to the chaos brewing at the front. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a silent observer of a system that had failed its own moral compass. The delay was no longer technical. It was existential. "I don't think, Bradley." "I know," Miller snapped. He hit the intercom to the lead flight attendant. "Sarah, where is the passenger from seat 4A? The one Bradley relocated?" There was a long pause on the other end. Sarah's voice came back, sounding hesitant. "He's in seat 38F, Captain, in the last row of economy. Is there something wrong?" Miller closed his eyes for a moment, silently cursing the arrogance of his co-pilot. "Everything is wrong, Sarah. Bring him to the cockpit immediately, and tell Bradley to stay in his seat and not say a single word." Down in the cabin, the atmosphere was shifting. The passengers in business class were beginning to notice the delay. The engines were humming, but the plane wasn't moving toward the runway. Lucas was sitting in the back, helping a woman next to him reach a toy her child had dropped under the seat. He was perfectly content, his mind far away from the petty drama of the front cabin. When Sarah appeared in the aisle, her face was a mask of professional terror. She walked straight past the executives, past the premium rows, and stopped at seat 38F. "Mr. Bennett," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas looked up, a small smile on his face. "Yes?" Sarah swallowed hard. "The captain would like to see you in the cockpit immediately, sir. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." The passengers around Lucas stared. The man who had been shoved to the back was now being summoned to the front by the flight crew. Lucas didn't make a scene. He didn't gloat. He simply stood up, grabbed his backpack, and followed her. As they walked through business class, the executives who had laughed at him watched in stunned silence. They saw the way the lead flight attendant held the curtain open for him with both hands. They saw the way she bowed her head as he passed. The hierarchy they had so carefully constructed based on clothing and attitude was collapsing in real time. Lucas walked past seat 4A without even looking at it. He wasn't interested in the seat anymore. He was interested in the man who had told him he didn't belong. The silence in the cabin was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. When Lucas stepped into the cockpit, Captain Miller stood up immediately, his hat in his hand. "Mr. Bennett, I am profoundly sorry," Miller said, his voice thick with genuine regret. "I had no idea you were on this flight. My co-pilot, he acted without my authorization or the proper verification of the manifest." Bradley was staring at the floor, his face a bright shade of crimson. He looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow the entire aircraft. Lucas stood in the small space, his denim jacket looking out of place among the high-tech glowing screens and expensive avionics. "It's quite all right, Captain Miller," Lucas said, his voice calm and steady. "I enjoy the view from the back every now and then. It reminds me of where I started." Miller shook his head. "It's not all right, sir. You own this aircraft. You own the company that leases this hangar. You practically own the runway we're sitting on. To be treated like an intruder on your own property is inexcusable." The cockpit door was slightly ajar, and the air seemed to hum with a newfound, terrifying electricity. Outside, the lead flight attendant stood like a sentinel, her eyes darting between the humble man in the jacket and the high-tech console. She realized that the security lockout wasn't a glitch. It was a digital recognition of the owner's presence. The aircraft itself had known its master was on board, even if the crew had not. The weight of the moment was heavy. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about a complete inversion of reality. Every flight attendant who had previously glanced at Lucas with indifference was now recalculating their entire career trajectory in a matter of seconds. The cabin door was cracked open just enough for the passengers in the front row to hear the exchange. The news traveled like wildfire. The denim jacket guy wasn't just a wealthy passenger. He was the owner. He was the man who had signed the checks for the very engines that were currently idling. The two executives who had laughed at him were suddenly very busy looking at their phones, their faces pale with the realization that they had just insulted the man who could end their careers with a single phone call. The air in business class grew cold, as if the air conditioning had suddenly turned to ice. Lucas looked at Bradley, who finally looked up, his eyes filled with fear. I didn't know, sir," Bradley stammered. "I just thought, the jacket and the bag." Lucas tilted his head slightly. "You thought that because I didn't look like you, I didn't belong in the space you were told to guard?" Bradley didn't have an answer. He was trapped in his own prejudice. Lucas didn't raise his voice. He didn't use his power to crush the young man. He simply stood there, a quiet force of nature that made every expensive thing in the room feel cheap. Captain Miller looked at Lucas, waiting for the order to fire the co-pilot. In the world of high-stakes corporate aviation, an insult to the owner was usually a career-ending move. "Sir, if you wish, I can have Bradley removed from the flight immediately and replaced by a standby officer," Miller offered. Bradley's breath hitched in his throat. He was waiting for the axe to fall, but Lucas just looked out the cockpit window at the distant horizon. "No," Lucas said. "That won't be necessary. Bradley is a skilled pilot, I assume. His flight records are clean?" Miller nodded. "He's technically proficient, sir, just lacking in judgment." Lucas turned back to Bradley. "I didn't say anything back there because I wanted to see who you were when you thought no one important was watching. People treat you how they think they're allowed to. You thought you were allowed to be cruel to me because you thought I had no power." Lucas's voice was a soft rumble, more powerful than a shout. He explained that true power was the ability to be invisible and still feel secure. He had watched Bradley's face as he pointed toward the back of the plane, not with professional concern, but with a visceral joy in his own perceived superiority. Lucas wanted to see if anyone else in the cabin would speak up, if any of the premium passengers would defend a man they thought was beneath them. No one did. The silence of the cabin during the confrontation had been the most telling part of the entire ordeal. It was a failure of the culture he had built. and he intended to fix it from the ground up. Lucas stepped closer to Bradley. I'm not going to fire you, Bradley. Humiliation is a poor teacher. But I am going to ask you to do one thing. I want you to step out into that cabin, pick up the intercom, and apologize to every single person on this flight. Not just to me, but to the elderly woman in 32B who you ignored when she asked for water. To the man in 15C who you spoke down to because his credit card was declined for a meal. You will apologize for the culture of arrogance you brought onto this aircraft. Bradley looked at the captain, then back at Lucas. He realized that this was a far more difficult punishment than being fired. He had to face the very people he had spent the last hour looking down upon. He walked out into the cabin, his legs feeling like lead. He picked up the handset and his voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is co-pilot Bradley. I am speaking to you today to offer a sincere and humble apology. I behaved with a lack of respect and professionalism that does not reflect the values of this flight or the man who owns it. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. No one cheered. No one laughed. They simply listened. Bradley apologized for his behavior, his voice cracking slightly as he finished. When he put the handset down, he looked at Lucas, who was standing at the cockpit door. Lucas gave a small, solemn nod. The truth was out, but it wasn't a victory of ego. It was a restoration of balance. Lucas hadn't used his wealth to win an argument. He had used it to teach a lesson about the only thing that actually mattered, how we treat each other when we think we have the upper hand. Captain Miller informed Lucas that the flight was now ready for departure and offered to clear the entire business class row so he could have total privacy. The flight attendants were already scurrying to prepare a special meal, the best wine, and a gift basket that was usually reserved for heads of state. They wanted to make up for the mistake with sheer luxury. They wanted to drown the memory of the denim jacket in a sea of silk and champagne. But Lucas shook his head. Keep the service exactly as it was planned, he instructed Sarah, and I'll be returning to my seat. Sarah blinked, confused. But sir, seat 4A is yours? It's the best seat in the cabin. Lucas smiled, a tired but kind expression. No, seat 4A is just a piece of leather. I'll stay in 38F. I was having a very interesting conversation with the woman next to me about her grandson's graduation. I'd like to finish it. The crew was floored. They had expected a demand for excellence, a display of dominance. Instead, they got a man who preferred the company of a stranger in economy over the isolation of luxury. As Lucas walked back through the cabin, the atmosphere was entirely different. The two executives who had mocked him were now desperately trying to look invisible. They didn't offer him their seats. They didn't try to strike up a conversation. They realized that any move they made now would only highlight their earlier shallowness. As Lucas sat back down in the cramped rear row, the woman next to him looked at him with wide eyes. The crew. They said you own the plane, she whispered. Lucas chuckled softly. Technically, a bank owns most of it. I just pay the bills. He then asked her more about her grandson, steering the conversation away from himself. He didn't want to be the billionaire on the plane. He just wanted to be a traveler. Throughout the flight, the co-pilot, Bradley, worked with a ferocity and a humility that the crew had never seen. He didn't stay in the cockpit. During the periods where the captain had control, Bradley came out into the cabin. He didn't just check the bins. He helped people with their bags. He brought extra blankets to the people who looked cold. He spent 10 minutes helping a young mother soothe her crying baby. He wasn't acting like a man who was afraid for his job. He was acting like a man who had finally seen the people behind the seat numbers. The flight attendants followed his lead. The service became less about premium in economy and more about care. The elderly woman in the back got her water and a warm towel. The man whose card had been declined was quietly told that his meal was on the house. The energy in the aircraft shifted from a pressurized tube of tension to a shared journey. Lucas watched it all from his seat in 38F, a quiet satisfaction in his heart. He had seen many leaders in his life, and he knew that the best ones didn't lead with a scepter. They led by example. As the plane began its descent, the lights of the city twinkling below like a carpet of diamonds, the captain's voice came over the intercom. It was a standard landing announcement, but Miller added a personal note at the end. I want to thank you all for flying with us today. It's been a reminder to all of us on the flight deck that every person on this aircraft is a VIP. We hope you enjoyed the journey as much as we enjoyed serving you. The landing was the smoothest Lucas had ever felt. As the plane taxied to the gate, the cabin remained calm. There was no mad rush to the overhead bins. There was a sense of mutual respect that hadn't been there when they took off. Lucas waited for the woman next to him to gather her things, helping her with her coat one last time. He was the last person to stand up, his old backpack slung over his shoulder, the denim jacket as wrinkled as ever. He wasn't leaving a throne, he was just getting off a plane. The cabin doors opened and the passengers began to deboard. Lucas stood at the exit, letting others pass him with a smile. As he reached the front, Bradley was standing by the cockpit door, his hat tucked under his arm. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. He didn't look like the arrogant young man who had demanded Lucas move seats. He looked like someone who had just finished the longest day of his life. "Mr. Bennett," Bradley said, his voice low. "Thank you." Lucas stopped and looked at him. "For what, Bradley?" Bradley swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "For not humiliating me when you had every right to. I thought I knew what power was. I thought it was the uniform and the ability to tell people what to do. Today I realized I didn't know anything." Lucas reached out and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. It was a firm, fatherly gesture. "Humiliation teaches nothing but resentment, Bradley. But humility teaches everything. You're a good pilot. Keep flying like you did today, and you'll be a great captain one day." Lucas didn't wait for a response. He walked out onto the jet bridge and into the terminal. Ethan was waiting for him at the arrival gate, standing with Lucas's sister. The boy's face lit up like a sunbeam when he saw his father. "Dad, you're back! Did you fly the big plane?" Lucas picked his son up, swinging him into the air. "Not this time, buddy. I was just a passenger today, but I met some very interesting people." As they walked toward the exit, Ethan looked at his dad's old jacket. "Dad, why don't you get a new coat? This one is all scratchy." Lucas laughed, pulling the boy closer. "Because this coat reminds me of who I am, Ethan, and sometimes it helps me see who other people are too." They walked out into the cool night air, disappearing into the crowd of thousands, just another father and son heading home. A few days later, the airline's corporate office received a brief internal memo from the Bennett Group. It didn't demand any firings. Instead, it authorized a massive investment in a new training program for all flight crews. It wasn't about safety or technical skills. It was about empathy and human service. The program was named the 4A Initiative, though only a few people in the company knew why. Bradley was the first pilot to enroll. He stayed with the airline, eventually becoming one of their most respected captains. He was known for being the only pilot who would regularly walk through the economy cabin during long flights, checking on the passengers himself. He never forgot the man in the denim jacket. He never forgot the lesson that real power doesn't need to be loud, and it certainly doesn't need to be proved. Lucas Bennett continued to live his quiet life. He still owned the aircraft, and he still owned the company, but he never sat in seat 4A again. He found that he liked the view from the back just fine. He knew that his place in the world wasn't defined by where he sat, but by how he stood up for others. The story of the man who was told to move seats became a legend within the airline, a quiet reminder that the most important person on the flight might just be the one you're tempted to ignore. If you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, please leave a comment and subscribe to the Daddy Healing Stories channel. We tell stories that shouldn't be forgotten, legends of silent heroes, the strength of single fathers, and the hidden kindness that changes the world. Thank you for being with us.